morning. We'd like to begin this morning with a little chant, once more from ancient tradition, that asks for our own personal well-being. The importance given to personal well-being has always been there, because unless and until we ourselves are strengthened, we ourselves are nourished, it's very difficult for us to be able to reach out to others around us. So today's chant asks for us to be nourished, for me to be nourished, my senses, my body and my mind. We'd invite you to repeat after us. Thank you. Ayurdhehi Pranandhehi Apanandhehi Dhyanandhehi Chakshurdhehi Shrotandhehi Manodhehi Vachandhehi Atmanandhehi Pratishthandhehi Mandhehi Mayi Dhehi Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. The chant asks, please let me be nourished. Let my life be strengthened. Let all the vital energies within me be strengthened. Let all my senses be sensitized. Let them be nourished. And let the mind be strong, firm and stable. Let the divine within me shine strongly and brightly. Let all these strengths that I have so that I can give of myself and I can share this strength with those around me. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Thank you.
The last 2 days, considering the child and his development, we considered it from the aspect of movement we considered it from the spiritual aspect and looked at how this helps the child construct a personality. The human personality expresses itself through movement. And I have pleasure in introducing to you today Baiba Crumins-Grazzini from the AMI Training Center in Italy, the Fondazione Centro Internazionale Studi Montessoriani. Now I hope I didn't murder that, and if I did, I'm sorry. Baiba has been working with that center since 1975. She worked with Camillo Grazzini, who is very well known in Montessori circles. Baiba herself needs very little introduction. Her experience with this age group is truly tremendous, and it is a privilege to have her share with us her understanding on language today. Please welcome Baiba Grazzini of Bergamo, Italy.
Just disappeared for a moment. Good morning to everyone. Oh, thank you. I'm very happy to be here. It's a real pleasure to be in India, to be here at Kalakshetra, and also at this Congress with all of you. So I would like to thank the Congress Committee. I too would like to thank the Congress Committee for being so kind as to invite me. So today we're going to consider language, and we had, did you notice, we had movement, the dance of life, and then we had yesterday morality, the thread of life, sort of guide, and today we have language, the song of life. I'm going to start with a quote. Amazingly enough, it's not a quote from Montessori, although I will have quotes from Montessori as well. This is a very simple quote from a neuroscientist called Lise Eliot. Can't help but talk. It is our fundamental means of social interaction. Well, think about this Congress. Is it not talk and social interaction? And then think, what about the social interaction and the talk that's going on right now throughout the whole city, the whole country, all over the world? Try to imagine what we would hear if only we could catch snatches of everyone's discussions and conversations. The whole world would be speaking if only we could hear it. The whole world would be alive with words of all kinds, in all moods, for all purposes, from prayers to sweet nothings, from verbal exchange for the sake of work and study, to the gossip of verbal grooming. Now we can also way. Dr. Montessori talks about the spheres that make up our Earth. And I'm sure many of you, if not all of you, have heard about these spheres. For example, the lithosphere, that's the sphere of the rocks, the hydrosphere, that's the sphere of water, atmosphere, which is the sphere of air, and so on. Well, there's also a very special sphere, and that is the sphere of human life and human energy. And what Dr. Montessori calls this the psychosphere. It's also known as the mind sphere. There's a wonderful man called Thomas Berry who wrote a book called The Great Work, who also talks about these spheres, and he calls this the mind sphere, but whether you call it the psychosphere or the mind sphere, it always means the same thing. Every sphere has its own characteristics, its own role in the story and the drama of the Earth. When it comes to the psychosphere, one of its outstanding characteristics has to do with a very particular, a most extraordinary gift bestowed by nature upon the human form of life, and that is the gift of articulate language. consequently, the psychosphere hums and vibrates with the sounds of human language. We can think of the whole world as being completely enveloped by this hum of human language. Thank you. Now, human beings do, of course, use language in every conceivable and imaginable way. For social communication, to think or communicate with oneself, for self-expression of one's individuality and feelings, to acquire knowledge and ideas, and therefore for one's own enrichment and growth. Language is used also as an aid to memory, to inform, I'm going to get more specific now, to inform and to misinform, to lie, in other words, to influence, persuade and manipulate, to gossip, to pray or communicate with the divine, to command, to rebel, to thank, to praise, to insult, hurt, bully and abuse, to pardon and forgive, to help, comfort and console. Just as in the world of nature, water flows and spreads everywhere, infiltrating wherever and whatever it can, so language permeates all things human. Human thinking, human expression, human work, and human relationships. However, from the point of view of the human story, that's to say, the story of human life on Earth, what stands out, above all else, is that human beings use their language for creating, building, maintaining their man-made environment. An environment which, as we know, Dr. Montessori calls supernature, or supranature, and which means above nature, coming from the Latin, above nature. And she calls it that because supernature is not directly provided by nature, but is built upon nature. So for example, it helps to have examples. So for example, schools, houses and homes, shops and hotels, roads, railways, ports, including airports, hospitals, libraries, concert halls, theatres, temples, churches and mosques, even farms, gardens and parks, and everything they hold and contain are all parts of supernature. In other words, these environments are not simply a result of all the materials and resources provided by nature, but they're also a consequence of human work, human effort, human endeavour. When I speak to the students in Bergamo about supernature, I always ask them to try and imagine this. In other words, to understand well what supernature means, you have to imagine that right now, everything that involves the work of human beings is removed. It disappears. Because to understand what supernature is, we can try and imagine just how important it is by wishing away its presence. So we have to imagine it disappears. Poof, it's gone. What would we be like? Okay, this building, it was made by human beings. Obviously it uses nature, but it was also made by human beings. So it involves human work as well as the work of nature, and it's gone. This is all gone. All your clothes are gone. You know, and you end up just sitting on the ground with nothing on. All your rings fly off. If you wear glasses, they're gone. Just left with your hair and your skin, and that's just about it. All right? So that just shows how much we depend on this supernature that we live in. All right. So, these environments then, we said, are a result of human work. A lot of human work, a lot of human effort, a lot of human endeavour. Building these supernatural or human environments is the task of the adult. Humanity, we always have to remember, is made up of both adult and child. And I did check out the population for the world. I'm sure we all think 6 billion. It's really actually quite over 6 billion. It's about 6.7 billion. But half the world's population is made up of people who are less than 18, which is absolutely amazing. So really it is about half and half, adult and child. So building these human environments is the task of the adult. It's obviously not the task of the child, it's the task of the adult. And it takes the work power of many, many, many adults to provide for the necessities of the inhabitants of a single modern town or city, Chennai, for example. Anything that we consume, that we use, that we consume, requires various stages of production, and therefore many different specialized workers, upon whom we are totally dependent for the satisfaction of our needs. Since we consume many things, and also give our own particular contribution to production, we live in societies that can be viewed as open-ended networks of production and exchange, networks of human interdependence and interrelationships, and therefore we could say of human solidarity. However, all this specialization, all this interdependence, all these interrelationships require incredible collaboration, an incredible coordination of activity, of work, of behavior. Could such collaboration and coordination be possible without language? It is clear that the specific organization of society as we find it today could not exist without the constant use of language. And in general, we can say it is language that permits human beings to organize themselves and to coordinate their activities so that they can satisfy their fundamental needs and survive, both physically and spiritually. So language brought and still brings magic and power into our lives. It permits individual human beings to function as a group, as a society, as an organized whole. And this is how Dr. Montessori's son, Mario Montessori, expresses it. So it's a quote. "The magic of language," he says, "not only made man superior, but made mankind into a kind of hydra with 1,000 heads." That's a very interesting metaphor that he's using, because in Greek mythology, the Hydra is a monster, and killing the Hydra was one of the tasks given to Hercules. It was one of his 12 labors. And the Hydra was well known because if you cut off a head, 2 immediately grew into the place of that single head. So it's strange that Mario Montessori is using this to illustrate the power that's given to human beings through language. So how you have to imagine this is that we're many people, many heads. I can see lots and lots of heads here. So we're many, many heads in a society. But through language, once we become organized through language, it's as though we constitute a single body, a single society. So continuing with the quote, "Nothing could withstand man after this magic had come into his life. When hunting, by the magic of these few sounds that constitute our language, speech, so when hunting, by the magic of these few sounds, the men, however few, became organized, and the animals had no chance of escape. A few words, and all could work together," means cooperate, collaborate, against some obstacle, and it disappeared. They could make it disappear. This magic made possible the birth of civilization. No collective task could be accomplished without language. Language which would lead to understanding between those people. In other words, the same language. Through a few sounds, all the world became organized. All the world of humanity became organized. They brought, these few sounds, they brought material and spiritual organization, so that the best and the worst in man was reached. A breath, somewhat greater than usual, and there was language. And that's taken from the London 1946 lectures. Mario Montessori also adds this, so I'm anticipating a little bit, but this is where he says it. He also adds this for the benefit of all teachers. He says, do not destroy this magic when you introduce language to the children. So whenever you work with language with the children, don't destroy the magic. Now I have a chart. And I've improved technologically because I pressed the button and something appeared on the screen. All right, now, there are two charts there that show human beings who make up a human group. The one on the left is familiar to you, right? It's the one that's the more well-known. The chart on the left is actually found in a booklet that Mario Montessori wrote called The Human Tendencies and Montessori Education. And so what you're seeing is, you see all those adults, right? And can you see they're all hooked up to this cloud above? And the cloud, can you read it, by the way? No. So the cloud above is identified as a spiritual territory. And then what it says within the cloud is behavior, custom, religion, morality. So you have to think everything that makes up, if you like, the culture of this human group, because some people use culture in this way, right? Human group lives in a particular spot on the earth at a particular time, obviously also. And it lives within nature, but remember the nature, human beings work on nature, so they develop a physical territory, which is not exactly the nature that they find, right? A park is certainly a physical territory, but it's not, a park is not just the work of nature. So there's a physical territory, but there's also spiritual territory. And within that spiritual territory, we can find all the customs, all the ways of behaving, the religion, all of the moral code of that particular human group. What's interesting is that language is not represented there. Anyway, there are two interesting things about this chart that we'll talk about a bit more later, because I want to come on to the second chart, that's different between the two charts. The one on the left has little children as well as adults. And you can see that the little children are not hooked up to the cloud, right? They have these little antennae, but they don't reach the cloud. And the other interesting thing is that the fact that language is not indicated there. Now you look at the chart on the right, which is less well known. It was actually published, printed in AMI Communications in 1962. And you can see it's just made up of adults. And they too are all hooked up to this sort of black circle up above. Now, being just adults, we can think of it like this. This is the explanation that we could give to this chart. But it must be to do with how these are members of a society, of a human group, all of these adults. And the circle above we can look on as supernature, right, which is after all constructed, built by adults. Can you see a dotted line that joins up the adults? Because they're all joined up to the cloud, but can you also see a dotted line that connects them up. It's like a circle that joins up every single person in that group, every single adult. Can you see a dotted line? Well, if you can see it, good, and if you can't see it, imagine that it's there, because it is there. That dotted circle actually connects the mouths of all the adults. You understand? The mouths are connected, so they have this means of communicating. They share a language. They can communicate with one another, which permits them to reach an understanding and therefore permits them to coordinate their behavior and their activities. And it leaves their hands free for the work that they have to do on this earth. Because the task of the adult, in the Montessori's thinking, the task of the adult is to create, to build. Montessori actually calls humanity God's chief agent on earth, for continuing creation. So these adults do create, they do build, they do a work of transformation, but it's directed, above all, the thinking here is, at the environment. So it's a question of creating a supernature, building a supernature, transforming the environment, that's the gift of nature, and transforming it into our human environment, the one that we all depend on now, the one in which we live. So the emphasis here is on adult work, the supernature they create, and what permits them to be able to do this, which is a common language. And so, of course, if we're thinking of adult work, we wouldn't expect to see children in that second chart, would we? Because we know that children have a completely different kind of work. They also create, they also build, they also transform. But they create themselves, build themselves, transform themselves as they grow and develop. Anyway, still on language, obviously, slightly different point of view. Language is most amazing, and it becomes very naturally to think, when did language arise? All right? Well, language as we know it has to do with us. So for many reasons, it is highly likely that language as we know it emerged together with our own species. And our own species is, you all know, Homo sapiens. We have very closely related species, of course, but they're all extinct, all right? So we're the only Homo left, the only species left in genus Homo. All the close relatives don't exist anymore. So language as we know it emerged together with our species, Homo sapiens, in Africa, this is on the basis of the evidence that we have, between 100 and 200,000 years ago, because different sources, you know, say different things, and that's not surprising, really. It's fascinating to think that there was perhaps one single original language, just as Genesis tells us with the story of the Tower of Babel. As our species migrated out of Africa to eventually populate all habitable parts of the world, so this original language, if there was just one original language, but many people believe that there was, so this original language would gradually have given rise to innumerable descendants with their innumerable offshoots, which now, more often than not, seem to bear no relationship whatsoever to each other. In other words, there arose, over time, there arose that Babel of tongues, and we have almost 7,000, at least that's what the estimates are, almost 7,000 spoken languages at the present time. So all these different tongues that seem to bear, more often than not, no relationship whatsoever to each other. And that means that people who at the source might have spoken the same language now cannot understand one another. You see how it resembles that story of Genesis. Okay, so people now can no longer comprehend one another. They become incomprehensible. All right? So anything they say to one another, if you don't share the same language, it's just incomprehensible. In fact, if you're not very respectful, you think of it as being gibberish. All right? Well, we're much more respectful these days, so we probably don't say gibberish just because it's a different language. But I remember when we were children and we didn't understand something, we used to say it's all Greek to me. Thinking of ancient Greek, I suppose. No, nothing personal to any Greeks present. And then, when we thought something was gibberish, we used to say it sounds like double Dutch. All right. Coming back to the human migrations, the early human migrations then led not only to diverging ways of life in the different parts of the world, but also to diverging forms of speech. And when the differences become sufficiently great, then the divergent forms are actually classified as different languages. When the divergences start, you can think of dialects of the same language or dialects of the same tongue. But as the differences get more and more pronounced, which they do if the people don't remain in contact with one another, then they start to be classified as different languages. And to this day, cultural diversity often implies language diversity. Now, Maria Montessori points out, as do many others, but she's very strong on this, she's very strong on language. She says, any particular language unites the group that shares it, but divides that group from all others. So language is both something that unites and unifies, but at the same time it's something that divides and separates. So here's the quote. So it happens, she says, that language is a kind of wall which encloses a given human company and that separates it from all others. It is something that unites men even more closely than nationality. And that's a quote from The Absorbent Mind. And I'm sure we all have enough experience that we can immediately agree. Sometimes the sense of division or separation is so strong that a particular human group might call itself the people. Easter Islanders, the original Easter Islanders, they called themselves the people, if I recall correctly. And I know for a fact that the word Inuit actually does mean people. But when a human group calls itself people or the people, it does sort of seem to imply that others are not quite people. Right? Just an aside on the term Inuit. We know that this is used. The word Inuit actually comes from the language of these particular inhabitants in Canada. And we're supposed to say Inuit now and not Eskimo, because Inuit is how they refer to themselves, it means people. And Eskimo is believed to be derived from another language completely, and the word meant eaters of raw meat. So there's no reason why we should call a people by anything other than the name that they give themselves. All right. So this idea of language dividing as well as uniting is, of course, very important, very true, very important. In the same way that religion unites the people who share the same religion and can divide, that group from other groups. Well, the same thing is true of language. And the fact that we have strange reactions, when we can't understand when someone else speaks. When I first lived in Italy, I used to travel very regularly, very frequently to England. And on the plane, I traveled by plane, and on the planes there'd always be Italians. I used to travel with British Airways and Alitalia, so you always get both nationalities on both airlines. And I can remember so often, one example I remember very well. There was an flight assistant on a British Airways flight, and this gentleman, Italian gentleman, asked for something in Italian. It was quite obvious he couldn't speak English. And then she was trying to say something to him, and he didn't understand. So what did she do? She raised her voice. It's totally illogical, right? But it's just comes so instinctively that without thinking, if you don't stop to think, if you don't respond, if you like, in a mindful way, then what you do is simply raise your voice as though the problem was one of hearing instead of not being able to understand the language. And it's really quite painful sometimes to find yourself, needless to say, I was very kind, and I did translate for that gentleman. I did my best to translate. But it's not just the British that did it to the Italians. The Italians also, on the Alitalia flights, did it to the British. So, and I also remember when I was a university student a long time ago, it was very fashionable to speak of culture shock. I don't know if it's as fashionable now to speak of culture shock as it was then, but I am convinced that one of the main factors in culture shock was actually language shock. And some of our students who come to Bergamo, we sometimes get students who've never been outside their own country. Perhaps they live in a large country and they've never come out. Well, then, of course, they do experience language shock. They do find it difficult to adjust and adapt. And really, they're moving from one Western country to another Western country. Because what we have to remember is it's very different to take a holiday. It's very different to go somewhere for a week, for 2 weeks, for 3. It's quite another thing to actually live. And life can become extremely complicated when you can't understand the language. And if people are not kind and one finds oneself alone, then of course one does feel lost, frustrated, and also it can happen dehumanized, because language is so deeply part of who we are that if we can't choose language, then we can feel actually dehumanized. So language truly is an integral part of who we are. Dr. Montessori actually calls it a psychic organ, which means along with will, memory, and so on, she classifies this or describes it as a psychic organ. The same neuroscientist that I mentioned at the beginning, that initial quote, Lise Eliot, she actually calls it an organ of the human brain. She's a neuroscientist, obviously. She thinks organ of the human brain. But what that means is that language is a great characteristic defining our human identity, our cultural or national identity, our individual identity. And in Montessori's words, so quote, without any doubt, she says, language must be considered as a human expression, that means in and of itself, human expression, as an expression of man in the society of other men, and as the expression of the intelligence. So you can see that there's this sort of triple, 3-in-1 kind of phenomenon, which is so typical, actually, of when a small child grows and develops. It's as though he has a triple task of development, develop the human characteristics. For example, we know a child's not born with the human characteristics of walking and talking, so it's actually a work of development to reach that. He also, through incarnation at the expense of his immediate environment, becomes a member of his human group, which is what those little children are trying to do, right? Because their antennae are too small to reach the cloud, but we can think of those antennae as curling toward the adult, right? The parent, perhaps particularly the mother, to start with. So their means to absorb, incarnate what surrounds them is actually through the medium of the adult, the person that takes care of them. And in this respect, I'd like to tell you something rather funny, that Mario Montessori Jr., he's actually a Dr. Montessori, but anyway, Maria Montessori's grandson, who was a psychologist and worked with many people in that capacity, and he said about these children, when they're very little, right, they have this attitude, it could be my mother, but let's say my father now, my father knows everything. Then they get a bit older and reach sort of second plane, and they say, well, my father knows a lot, but my teacher knows more. And then, when do the antennae finally reach the cloud, so that they're independently attached to the cloud and not going through the mother or the father? When they become adolescents, and at that point, the adolescent says, my father knows nothing. All right. So, I said a triple task, right? So the little child has a triple task: to become a human being, to become a member of his human group, and of course to develop himself as an individual. So it's very interesting that there's this triple type of development, but we can see this triple aspect also in language, because language in general is a defining characteristic of human beings. A particular language is associated with a particular human group, and then how anyone uses that language is obviously very much part of who they are as an individual. So I said our human identity, our cultural or national identity, our individual identity. Okay, and so Montessori says it's human expression in and of itself, as an expression of man in the society of others, and as the expression of the intelligence as the individual. So, I'm going to sum up then what we've said so far. Firstly, human society as we know it could not exist, could not function without human language. Secondly, human language actually consists of thousands of languages. And thirdly, language can be regarded as a psychic organ, or indeed as an organ of the human brain, and is therefore an innate, inborn characteristic of the human being. And yet, as we know, no human being is born with language. No human being inherits a particular language. No human being is born with a psychic or brain organ fully developed. Therefore, language is also a learned characteristic. The child, in other words, is born with the potential to acquire language, but is simultaneously faced with the developmental task of actually acquiring the particular language that's spoken around him. Now that's actually, it's an awful lot of work for the little child, but he does it all unconsciously and he doesn't seem too fatigued by it. Okay, and it's actually quite brilliant from the point of view of the fact that nature in this way ensures that the child will be adapted to or at one with, and we could also say in harmony with, the environment that directly surrounds him. So it's through absorbing the language, incarnating the language that's spoken by the adults, really, that also permits the children also to hook up, in the end, to that cloud that represents the spiritual territory. Only if the child can fulfill his task of adaptation to all the aspects of the surrounding environment, including the linguistic environment, will the child be able to grow peacefully and in harmony with his fellow human beings. Growing in peace and in harmony with his environment, both the human environment and that of nature, ensures that one day he can become a fully functioning member of his society. In other words, he can become an adult whose healthy relationship with his society and country is expressed through both love and work. Just as the child that he once was grew through both loving his environment and working in his environment. Now, since my subject today is language, I thought I would like you to get a feel, I'd like to express it in a sort of from the heart sort of way, what incarnation means, okay? And since language, has its literature, and there are various forms of literature, I decided that I'd read you a poem. Okay? So that you understand what incarnation means, in this particular case expressed by a poet. And I'll first just read the poem, and then I'll tell you the poet, etc. I find this very moving, if I can just say this. I will tell you, this poet is English, a young man, a young Englishman. And although I'm British as a citizen, I don't have a drop of English blood, and I didn't get to England until I was 5 years old, and I've never felt myself to be English, quite honestly. And this poem is about England, which is, I grew up in England from the age of 5 on, but I know all about what incarnation means because what I incarnated was not England when I was little, right? Only after the age of 5 did I arrive there. But it doesn't matter what country we're talking about here, because I could be talking, it could be by a French poet, it could be by an Indian poet. Anyway, this is what this young man says, this young poet. If I should die, and some of you may know this actually, if I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. There shall be in that rich earth a richer dust concealed, a dust whom England bore, shaped, made aware, gave once her flowers to love, her ways to roam, a body of England's breathing English air, washed by the rivers, blessed by sons of home. And think, this heart, all evil shed away, a pulse in the eternal mind, no less, gives somewhere back the thoughts by England given, her sights and sounds, dreams happy as her day, and laughter learned of friends, and gentleness in hearts at peace under an English heaven. It's so beautiful, right? And this poor young man, the poem's actually called The Soldier, and he went off to the First World War. It's Rupert Brooke. The poem's called The Soldier. He went off to the First World War, and within a year he died. So he probably did end up as dust in some foreign field. But the point is, it's just the feeling he captures, the whole feeling of what it means to have incarnated, you know, everything involved in the way a human group lives. And it's that love that really emerges. Okay. So, move on. The young child's love for his environment, then, encompasses language, the language that surrounds him, the language that he must acquire during his early years of life, if that language is to become his mother tongue, and the language of his heart as well as of his head. The language that is meant to become a psychic organ, to be used for expressing all of oneself in a masterly way, with clarity, simplicity, and ease. Perhaps as adults we have had first-hand experience of learning a language, or maybe I should say of trying to learn a language, and therefore we know just how hard and difficult that is. Yet the little child succeeds where the adult fails. The child's language, says Dr. Montessori, develops naturally, like a spontaneous creation. Its development follows fixed laws which are the same in all children. All children pass through a period in which they can only pronounce syllables. Then they pronounce whole words. And finally, they use to perfection all the rules of syntax and grammar. It's really amazing, because I've experienced learning a language as a child that wasn't my mother tongue, that was a second language, and I've also experienced learning a language as an adult when I went to Italy. And it's completely different. And we all know that, but some of us have actually experienced it. And the way I see it is that when you learn the language as a child, it's so easy, it's so second nature. You don't have to concentrate to understand. You can't help but hear what people are saying. Whereas if you learn a language with all that effort when you're an adult, you can switch it off, because it takes concentration to understand. You always have to concentrate. So if you don't want to hear it, stop concentrating, so then you won't be distracted by what other people are saying and so on. But it is completely different. And the way I see it also is that when you learn it as a child, it's as though the language permits you to fly. You're so free. You know, you're so, if you like, independent. It's that freedom that comes from independence, almost, you know, it's that freedom that we associate with flying. And when you learn another language as an adult, you're always stumbling, just always stumbling. It's just really difficult. And what makes it hard, of course, is that there are all these little children who speak the language perfectly. All right, now, we don't really have to go into the details, but I decided to give you some details. So I'm just going to do it very quickly, so you understand, perhaps for some of you, this may be interesting, and for the rest you just have to be patient. I'm sure that has to do with sadhana as well, being patient. All right, so Montessori elaborates the child's incarnation of the language that surrounds him, or rather the development of language, let's say now, within the little child. She says, in the mysterious period which follows immediately after birth, the child, who is a psychic entity endowed with especially a refined form of sensitiveness, might be regarded as an ego asleep, but all of a sudden he wakes up and hears delicious music. So that's the sense of hearing, right, that's involved there. At 4 months, the babe becomes aware that this mysterious music which surrounds him and touches him so deeply comes from the human mouth. The mouth and its lips produce it by their movement. So interesting, isn't it? Because Dr. Montessori always points out the connection between movement and sound. And the same is true for language. One way that we could think about it is that the music of the language has to do with the dance of all those little muscles that are involved in producing language. So the child hears the music, then he sees the dance, because, you know, he's watching the mouth and the lips closely. Montessori says how closely the baby watches the lips of a person speaking. He looks at them most intently and tries to imitate the movements. After watching, so there's the sense of sight, right? So for the music, the ear's enough. But if you want me to see the dance, then of course you have to look. After watching the speaker's mouth for 2 months, the child produces syllabic sounds, by then being 6 months old. For some time he will go on pronouncing only syllables. And I had a very interesting experience very recently with an old Bergamo student who came back to Bergamo for a weekend with his partner and his little child that was 6 to 7 months old. He didn't come to visit me, but we just bumped accidentally in the road. I'm being a bit mean now. It was just a weekend. The centre's closed at the weekend. Anyway, I was speaking to this child, and this little 6.5-month-old girl, really, I mean, she just watched. She was so fascinated. I mean, I was so tempted to think she was fascinated because I was speaking to her, but she wasn't fascinated by that at all. She was fascinated because I was coming out with a language with which she was not familiar. And it was just amazing. All right, so that's just an example. At 10 months, the child makes another discovery, that the music coming from the person's mouth has a purpose. At 1 year of age, the child says his first intentional word. At about 1.5 years, the child discovers that each thing has its own name. This shows that from all the words he has heard, he has been able to single out the nouns, and especially the concrete nouns. He was aware of being in a world of things, and now each of these is indicated by a special word. The child then enters a period that Montessori refers to as a period of condensed speech, but which apparently nowadays is known as telegraphic speech. And this period leads the child into uttering phrases, Montessori says of a few words, or we could just think two words, after which the child enters an explosive epoch, first of words and then of sentences. And she says, these explosive happenings and eruptions and his powers of expression continue in the child until well after the age of 2. So there become established the mental structures and language mechanisms of expression peculiar to the race or social class to which the child belongs. This is a treasure prepared in the unconscious, which is then handed over to consciousness. Now, we heard a great deal about how the child is father of the man. It's so easy to think that the child is the son, or indeed the daughter of man. But when you think of the child as being the one that creates the adult, what's much more important, who's creating whom, is the child who creates the adult. And then we say, well, the child is the father of the man. All right? So it's the same sort of thing that's being said here. A treasure that's actually prepared in the unconscious, which will be handed over to consciousness. And of course, eventually, that power will be inherited by the adult. It's part of the creation of the adult. And the child was still back at the age of just after 2.5. The child, in full possession of his new power, talks and talks without cessation. So by now, the child is around 2.5 or 3 years old, and then he enters a new period of language development, a period during which he refines and enriches his language by learning many, it's nice to repeat sometimes, new words, and by perfecting the formation of his sentences. Now, it's very interesting to think, when you look at the development of language, to think, well, what are the key elements then of language that tell you what the themes are for language development? Well, as Dr. Montessori indicates, as anybody who studies the development of language indicates, these key elements are sounds, and it is remarkable that the little child makes sounds. And it's also considered as an indirect proof of the sensitive period for language, because the child wants to make those sounds and produces those sounds before they have any meaning whatsoever. So what is it that's driving him to produce those sounds, if not this sensitive period, this sensitivity, this intense attraction to human language? So sounds, words, and sentences. The sounds of a language constitute, if you like, a kind of alphabet, because the sounds are always limited. Any language, in English, for example, well, some people would say we have about 40. I think it's really closer to 50 categories of sounds, right? So it's always limited. When you think of the thousands and thousands and thousands of words that exist in the English language and that we can pronounce and utter, it's all done with a limited number of sounds. So you've got sort of alphabet, limited set of sounds that strung together, those sounds put together, combined in different ways. It's endless. People have tried to work out the mathematics of it, and it's as good as the possibilities are as good as an infinite number of words. All right, so sounds, words, and these words, of course, we can look on as the bricks of our language. So that's what we use for building our sentences. And then the sentences are those meaningful strings of words which express complete thoughts in a grammatical, that is to say, in a clear way. All right, so those are the key elements that are singled out in the development of language, but above all by Dr. Montessori and presumably others as well, because she always refers also to other psychologists. But there is another aspect of language to consider as well, and it's the aspect known as prosody. What does that mean? It means the overall musical quality of a language has to do with the rhythm and patterns of stress and intonation in a language. And it really is what makes a language, lends a musical quality to the language. And what's it? Because it has to do with pitch and stress and rhythm. And what's interesting about this is whereas pronouncing sounds, uttering words, uttering sentences has to do with the left hemisphere of the brain, has to do with half our brain, right? This musical aspect of language has to do, it's above all found located in the right hemisphere of the brain, and it's this hemisphere which has more to do with emotion. Now, this aspect of language, I think you would agree, finds its highest expression actually in poetry, right? Which depends, I mean, the classic characteristics of poetry are indeed rhythm and stress and intonation. And without this aspect, language is expressed in a monotone, and it's very flat. People who are injured, brain, suffer an injury to the right hemisphere of the brain, can retain the sounds, the words, the sentences, but they talk in a completely flat sort of way, if that's the part of the right hemisphere that's been damaged. And it's very strange because it doesn't sound natural at all. So I thought I'd give you an example, since poetry is the peak, from the point of view of musical quality. I wanted to give you an example, although it's almost impossible to do this in a monotone, but I will read you this, or part of this poem, with this musical. You understand how much music there is really in the poem. Oh, is it making a loud sound? How's this then? All right, where are we? This is John Masefield, and the poem's called Sea Fever. Have I been making a horrible sound all this time? Oh, thank goodness for that, oh gosh. It's a little bit like having something in your teeth and nobody tells you, so a long time afterwards. Awful. All right. And the poem goes like this. I must go down to the seas again, to the lonely sea in the sky, and all I ask is a tall ship and a star to steer her by, and the wheels kick, and the wind's song, and the white sails shaking, and a grey mist on the sea's face, and grey dawn breaking. I must go down to the seas again, for the call of the running tide is a wild call and a clear call that may not be denied. And all I ask is a windy day, with the white clouds flying, and the flung spray and the blown spume and the seagulls crying. I must go down to the seas again, to the vagrant gypsy life, to the gull's way and the whale's way, where the wind's like a whetted knife. And all I ask is a merry yarn from a laughing fellow rover, and quiet sleep and a sweet dream when the long trick's over. So the rhythm in that, you can practically feel yourself with this person, at sea in a ship. A person who's lost that musical quality, it's all just one tone. So it would be like, I don't even like to do it actually, but anyway, how are you? I am very well. It didn't rain today, at least not when I was awake, not when I noticed. And it's all like that, and it does, this musical quality, we take it for granted, we don't even think about it, but when it's not there, then we really realize, its presence through its absence. All right. Now, coming back to these key elements then, the sounds, the words, and the sentences. As regards those key elements of language associated with the left hemisphere, both the ability to isolate and produce individual sounds perfectly and the ability to use and understand the grammar of a particular language can only be acquired by the young child. People who learn or try to learn a language as adults always speak the language with a foreign accent and always make grammatical mistakes. However, luckily for all of us, when it comes to words, we can continue to expand our vocabularies throughout our lives, even though perhaps not with the same facility as the young child who has a developmental hunger for new words and is living through a sensitive period for language until the age of around 6 years. So of all these elements, the ones that we will never acquire perfectly are the pronunciation and really the grammar. But we can keep acquiring vocabulary even in a second or third language that we're learning as an adult. And we certainly continue, even as adults, to acquire new words, which is just as well, if you think about it, because it's absolutely vital if as individuals we wish to keep learning new skills, new ideas, new concepts for the whole of our lives. How could we do that if we couldn't keep expanding our vocabularies? And it's also vital, this power, that there's something of that power is maintained, because language itself keeps evolving. Gradually, but constantly, language keeps changing. And you know, when you live abroad, away from your own country, and you go back regularly to visit it, you become highly aware of the new words that enter the language, and also expressions that seem to start to die away. Some of those new words and expressions that enter the language don't last, so that's why the dictionaries wait a while before they decide to include them. But some of them become permanent fixtures of the language. And it's something that the people who live in that country and with that language all the time hardly notice. But if you keep coming back and forth as a visitor, you notice it very much. And of course, you always feel a little strange because you feel as if you're really not quite belonging there. I was once sitting next to another passenger on the airplane, and she lived the same kind of life as I did, and we really decided that in the end, where were we completely at home was in the plane, going back and forth between the two countries. All right. The language changes particularly rapidly, you know, more than gradually, rather more rapidly, when the society is in a phase of rapid technological change, because then there's a real need for new words. All right. Now, coming back to the young child and the time when the power and magic of language becomes his, which of course is the time also that he becomes independent from this, in this very important sense, I want to give you a quote from that neuroscientist. She says, "Learning to talk is probably the greatest intellectual leap of an individual's life. It opens up a new universe of questions, reasoning, social communication, and opinions. And these," she says, "make a child finally seem like a full-fledged person." Language is also the critical foundation for much of what we consider to be intelligent behavior. The more we understand about how the language organ of the brain develops, the better we can foster this most important basis of our children's intellectual development. That's the end of the quote. So what can adults and teachers do during the children's house and elementary years in order to help the children comprehend their language more fully, appreciate their language more consciously, and generally enrich their language? Now, I don't think that this is the time and the place to discuss all the different kinds of help that are offered, you know, in the children's house and in the elementary. So I'm just going to limit myself to very general indications. How am I doing for time? Not very well. Not well at all. I've just realized. Is it true it's 25 past 10? Oh. That's a shame. I was sure I finished this part in half an hour, you know. Okay. Now, I've already said that Mario Montessori calls this unique human ability that is language, he calls it the magic of language. And he asks educators to reflect on their attitude to language as they work with children. All right? And he says, I'm paraphrasing, not quoting, he says that we educators have to bring out the best in everything that we offer to the children. Right? So we must always think of the best. We have to offer the best. And he says that we ourselves should be filled with understanding and knowledge of whatever we wish to introduce into the lives of children. There is, he says, and he said this over 60 years ago, a modern tendency to ask for the minimum rather than the maximum. And you know that a child's work, when a normalized child works, that child works with maximum effort. If he does not work with maximum effort, he cannot develop and grow in the same way. Development requires maximum effort. But unfortunately, there is a modern tendency of adults requiring the minimum effort on the part of the children rather than maximum. Obviously, I'm not talking about Montessori adults or Montessori environments. Okay? So he says, requiring the minimum, expecting the minimum, is a very defeatist attitude. And the implications of this, what are they? That people, human beings, are lazy. It's like saying, well, we think human beings are lazy, uninterested. And this, he says, is to see human beings in the worst light, not in the best light. But if we look at human history and we realize how much human beings have achieved, and they have achieved, there's an enormous amount of achievement really on the part of human beings. We mustn't always look at what's bad and what's negative, and especially not with the children, right? If we consider all of human history in terms of what human beings have achieved, right, then we realize that there's this good side to humanity. There's that side of humanity that really does work, that's intelligent, that's good, that puts in effort. And because human beings have achieved, they've only been on the earth such a short space of time. I said our species emerged 100 to 200,000 years ago. That's really nothing in terms of the age of the earth, which we know is 4.6 billion years old. So we're very much jolly come latelys, let's say, and yet we've done an enormous amount, for better or for worse. All right? So it's not possible in the light of human history to say that human beings are lazy or uninterested. So when we think of language, so it's all, he's saying this so that we change our attitude perhaps, right? That we really do think of language as something magical. All right, so when we think of language and we wish to present language to the children, we must never take a defeatist attitude. We must never be frightened that we're requiring too much, or that we're going to send the poor child's brain cells into some fit or other, because children are very intelligent. Okay, if we find that the children are not interested, then the solution from a Montessori point of view is that we've got the age wrong, or the manner how we offer that particular aspect of language or that particular part of language, we're not doing it the right way. So we always have to look at the age and how, what the approach is, right? But if the time is right and the manner is right, then we're working with nature, and then we'll see the best of human nature, right? I mean, then we'll see what the human mind is capable of, okay? In this particular case, if the child can develop in the best possible way, then we know that's going to make a huge difference to humanity. So before we offer language to children, we have to understand for ourselves the wealth that we possess when it comes to language. And our attitude in all of this is fundamental, it's crucial. So we should never, to use a modern expression, dumb down to children. And it's very interesting that a teacher told me that just very recently, the children's vocabularies, a certain age, is much less, by a certain age, is much less than it used to be. Well, the fault can't lie in the children, because not the children's potentials have decreased. So there's something wrong in terms of what's in the environment for the children and what's being offered to the children. Right? And indeed, there are many adults who have a tendency now to reduce language as though words constitute a sort of burden on the children, as though they weigh the children down. But if we take this attitude, then obviously if we think words are a burden, then we don't want to overstress the children, overload the children, right? So then we start to act as though our language is made up of only a few words, instead of being made up of a wealth of words. So what we have to understand is that we inherit all the richness of the language, all of its words. It's as though, Maya says, it's as though we've inherited the wealth of millions of souls. It has been bequeathed to us as a type of magic, a kind of magic that leads us out of obscurity, out of darkness, into light, because it helps us to lead our lives in a conscious way. And it also leads us into the warmth of company and human relationship, because without language, we live in solitude. I know silence is a wonderful thing. We've heard what wonderful things silence is, and silence is undoubtedly, I'm sure, part of sadhana. But that silence has to be chosen once we have the wealth of language. So it is a choice. It cannot be a silence that comes from misery and poverty. It's a completely different thing. Well, unfortunately, I have to stop. I'm so sorry. But maybe you're not. No, I haven't finished. Sorry. No, one more thing. Just one more thing. I do want to give a quote. I'm going to end with a quote that's taken from an article by Camillo Grazzini called Cosmic Education at the Elementary Level and the Role of the Materials. And he quotes Montessori. All right, he quotes, and he says this, talking of Montessori, Dr. Montessori stresses the interdependence of human beings, both as individuals and as nations. All right? Obviously, the human beings and nations that exist now, but not only that interdependence, which links us spatially, geographically, but also the interdependence that links the present to the past and to the future. So all these human beings have achieved so much also when it comes to language, right? And it benefits us, right? We inherit so much from people of the past. And this is a solidarity which we can see as stretching through the ages, through time. A solidarity which projects itself into the future and is sunk in the remotest ages of the past, thereby linking the past to the present and the present to the future for all eternity. And this is a most wonderful thing. There is, if you like, a song of life that sounds through time, linking us to the earlier generations and linking us also, because we're only part of this link, linking us also to future generations. As a present generation, we can only receive from the past, but in exchange, we can and we will give to the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you so much. There's a special announcement that Raghu and a group of people need to make.
We're just waiting for the last member of our team here to join us. Govind's just been found by his very enthusiastic runners. The four of us are here because we've been, I really need to introduce ourselves again. I think that our names have been read out a couple of times. This is Govind Venkateshan, and this is Prasanna Srinivasan, Hadrian Roche, and I'm Rukmini Ramchandran, and one of our team members is not here today, and we miss her very much, Vasumati Srinivasan, who now lives in the United States. We are the team that actually put together and nailed together the book that many of you have been buying in the last few days, The Montessori in India, 70 Years. And we really came up to make this announcement because we've been approached by many of you in the audience to say that there are more stories to tell. And as we said in the very introduction to this book, that it was not an effort to be comprehensive, but to really start making a record of what was available. So we would really dearly love to tell people we are very aware that this book has gaps, and we are just happy to tell you that now there is a book in which there are gaps, and so now these gaps need to be filled. And so there are many lost stories in this, as in all stories to do with history, and we've just been talking about the importance of language and the importance of passing it on. So, to preserve our history and to feel a sense of connection with our past, we request all of you to approach any of us, and to also, for those of you who have the Congress website, this will be our ongoing task, that this is a process that has begun, and please do approach us with any stories that you have with which we can add to, so that the second edition of this book is more complete and has fewer gaps than the one that you see with you now. We do also request you to buy the book. It's on the last stall down the exhibitors corridor and will be on sale all day. Thank you very much.
A couple of more announcements. Please bear with me. Sorry to keep you from your tea. When you sat down this morning, you found on your chairs a little raffle ticket which had been placed there by the ladies at the AMI stall. They brought with them these Montessori posters, and they find themselves unable to carry them home. And so they very kindly have offered each of you a raffle ticket, and at the end of the day, one of the children will pick 2 names from a box, and those lucky people, just randomly chosen, will each be able to take home a poster. They have a request. If when your name is picked, you find that you cannot, for whatever reasons, take home the poster, if you tell them immediately, no, I really can't carry it home with me, we'll pick a different name and give someone else a chance. Thank you very much for that, list for your attention. Okay. They tell me that they're going to pick the name now. So if you have your ticket, please keep it. They're very afraid that you might lose these tickets. So if you wait here for a moment. Okay. Can we settle down for a couple of more announcements before we pick it? Because then it will be all the excitement of collecting the poster, and then you won't be listening to anything I say. To clarify yesterday's announcement with regard to airport transfers, those delegates that made their hotel booking as part of the Congress package through the Congress organizers had their airport transfers as part of that transport included in the hotel booking made via the Congress. If you had that arranged for you via the Congress, please contact the Congress office where there's a transport desk who will make sure that we have your flight number and can actually make you get to the airport in time for your departure. We regret that if you did not make your hotel booking through the Congress package, we are not at this moment able to offer this help. A request again. We find on looking at accounts that we have several payments outstanding. If you are aware that you have any kind of accounts outstanding with the Congress office, payments for hotels because you booked at the very last minute, payment for transport because there was a bus going and although you hadn't booked, you thought, well, let me get it. We are very glad that you were able to use our facilities and avail of the arrangements, but please contact the office and settle all accounts today. Today is the last day to do so. This is, as Ruku said, one of the last opportunities you will have to easily purchase the book or to avail yourself of the chance to get a Congress mug as a memento or a Congress t-shirt. This is also your last chance to visit the MTRT stall again in the same line with the Congress stall and look at the beautiful book of photographs that has been compiled by the center in Hyderabad and avail of the chance to acquire a copy of that book and to get your name registered for the Assistance to Infancy course if you happen to be interested. These stalls will all close by 4 o'clock today, and if the rain comes as it's threatening to do, we might have to put the stalls down earlier. So please, at the earliest chance, go past those stalls, take a look at what's there, see what you need to get for yourself. There's also, as you approach the theatre, a whole load of posters that children from many, many different schools have spent hours making to put up for you to look at. Please do look at them. It would be pity to miss that. And now for the draw of the raffle. And you come to the front and draw so that they can all see. Thank you. Whoever has token 230. 230. And 674. 674. And I'm presuming you're happy to take the poster with you. If you would go with the children, the ladies. Thank you very much. Please enjoy your tea break.